I'm going to be looking at the lives of two women, and this is not a typo, by the way. This is actually Chanel's real name, and we'll work out, in fact, it's central to my argument as to why she went to her grave as Chanel and not as Chanel. So the lives of these two women intersect, although they never meet each other, during the occupation of Paris in 1940, between 1940 and 1944. Now, both of these women lived or came from very, very modest backgrounds, which one will make out happen and the other one will bring to the fore. Chanel, as you know, lived through the occupation in luxurious circumstances in the Ritz, dining on champagne, caviar, and roulade rôti, while the majority of the population starved. Rose Valland was the curator or voluntary curator of the Jeu de Paume, and she daily risked torture, execution, to be able to record what was happening to the works of art that Goering was taking from the Jewish families. And she will be responsible, basically, at the end of the war, for recuperating something like 60,000 works of art. At the end of the war, liberation of Paris in 1944, Chanel goes into exile, into circumstances that we'll look into, whereas Rose Valland becomes the most decorated woman in French history. Has anyone ever heard of her? Who has not heard of Chanel? All right, now this lecture is not about two things. Firstly, it's not about what an awful person Chanel was, someone who manages to survive in a climate of depravity, of violence, a person who has no moral compass and no ethics. As you can see, I'm not a fan. That is the first thing that I'm really actually not talking about. This really isn't the great problem. The other thing I'm not going to talk about is the clothes, and certainly not those awful handbags, which, you know, really, anyway, we'll move on from that. What I really am talking about is the way in which they are seen by history, and the way in which the personal narratives of these women are taken up on a national level and turned into a national myth. In the case of Chanel, she manages to eliminate all references to her poor past, and then manages to buy off or get rid of even the testimonies of the Nazi superiors who would also have given her away. Money, in other words, does everything. So what the other thing with Chanel was that France was so desperately humiliated by the way in which they caved in to the Germans. The Germans were rather surprised actually at how easy it was and the level of collaboration that existed. And they needed this sort of icon of glamour and beauty to perpetuate the myth of Paris being the center of culture, the center of beauty, back to the Ancien Regime days of the glory of French culture. Added to this was the fact that when de Gaulle came to power, he was confronted with this problem of mass collaboration with the Germans, and develops the myth, by the 1950s, develops the myth that basically not just there was the resistance, but that everyone was a resistor. In fact, there was a tiny minority of the French who actually joined the resistance. Very, very, very few. And this has been something which has humiliated the French and which is something that they're sort of dealing with even now to some degree in the elections and so on. So Chanel benefits from this myth, and she will come back in 1954 out of exile. No one wants to know about collaborators. And at the same time, no one wants to know about people who sacrificed their lives for France. In other words, it's no longer sort of sexy to talk about Rose Valland, if anyone could even remember who she was. And as we'll see, a film will be made about the exploits of the people who blocked the trains, etc. But it's all about the railway workers, all about the men. You know, you've got Kirk Douglas, you know, with a rifle. She's practically eliminated from history. So I think this is really what I'm talking about, the way in which, you know, the narratives of history always go with the winners, but also the way in which we are so trivial. I mean, everyone sort of worships the Chanel brand. It's everywhere, you know, in every city. You know, it's because it's glamorous, because it's related to fashion, it's related to perfume. No one was really interested to someone who's prepared to sacrifice herself for the beauty of art. And she says that time and time again. So I want to actually now then look at the lives of these people. You know, everyone knows about Chanel. And the other thing that I also want to mention is that she is a remarkable woman. I mean, remarkable in the sense that she rises above extraordinary circumstances and probably had an extremely narcissistic personality. I mean, I think, you know, if you look at it from a psychological point of view, she becomes interesting. I'm not sure about the rest. All right, so these are these two women. As you can see, one's extraordinarily good looking and the other one isn't. And really, I mean, you really wonder in our civilization or our society, if everything is visual, I mean, it makes such a difference if you're good looking. You know, all of us would know that. All right, so we have this empire which has been set up. There's this god awful bag that looks like that, and the perfume, of course. Now,
not wearing that today.
There's I hope no one actually has one with them. My audience will walk out. Right, she is always portrayed. Here she is. This is what she was like. She's portrayed in the film The Monuments Men by Cate Blanchett. But even in the film The Monuments Men, they don't call her by her name. She's given another alias. And when sort of asked why is she not known as Rose Valland, they said, oh, it'll give us more, you know, chance to make a sort of narrative, a fictional narrative about her. She was also gay, which again, would probably be a problem in a very Catholic France. She formed a liaison with an American interpreter. Well, Gabrielle Coco Chanel, as you can see, was quite beautiful and was born in desperately poor circumstances. And I mean desperately poor. She was in a family, I think it was 5 siblings. The father was an itinerant salesman. You know, they lived in one room virtually. She was born in the sort of hospice for the abjectly poor. Her mother dies when she is 11, and the father gets rid of the boys, sends them off to work as labourers, and the 3 girls are sent to this abbey at Aubezine, which is run by the Sisters of the Holy Heart of Mary, one of, I'm not sure if that's actually quite the right congregation, but that's it. And she will live there for 7 years, and from 11 till 18. Now, this was an extremely austere, it was originally a Cistercian monastery, and as you know, Cistercian monasteries are known for their starkness. You know, there's no decoration whatsoever. What you get is the white, and the shadows which fall across it, of course, are dark. And this is quite possibly going to work into the ethic or the sort of visual systems of Chanel. And as you can see, look, I'm talking about her as though she's Michelangelo. Do you know what I mean? You know, what were the, you know, the influences on this great person? All right, but it's certain that this austere environment does come out in the fashion that she will produce. And she also, when she becomes a millionairess or one of the richest women in Europe, the house that she will build on the Côte d'Azur will imitate this early Cistercian abbey. Now, it's mysteriously the archives of this order have disappeared for the 8 years that she was there. They just seem to have disappeared. They're there before, but they're not there afterwards. All right, now her two sisters don't have the grit or whatever it is that she has. Both of them will commit suicide in different cases. One is a single mother, another one from a drug overdose. And she will theoretically adopt one of the children of her sister. So you can already see she's quite exceptional in these extraordinary circumstances. So she's pushed into this convent and looks up at the windows, and there you can see this interlocking sea already. And also the number 5, which is one of the numbers of hope, faith and charity that she would have seen as she walked into church every day, into prayers. And everything she does is on the 5th. She opens things on the 5th. It's her lucky number. Now, these actually are Dominican nuns, but you get the idea of the interest in black and white, you know, and the draping also of the cloth, you know, the long, heavy woolen draping and the way in which it falls, and also the girdles that the sisters wore, which you will end up seeing to some degree in the shoulder strap of the bag. Now, there are a number of things that she learns here in this convent. First of all, they taught to sew, all right, and embroider, and she loves it, and to iron and to produce, you know, how to work with seams and so on. Also, extraordinary self-discipline, which she will need. She has an extraordinary work ethic, but also the intangible things that she will inhale, and that is profound anti-Semitism, which will be what links her to the British aristocracy, which is something quite interesting, and also homophobia. So she has all of these things which are latent and which are brought out by her relationships with a number of the men that she deals with. Now, I just wanted to sort of show you this sort of outfits that she has, the black and the white, and this one here is really based on a schoolboy's outfit when she used to see, when these private schoolboys, she'd be going out on one of her excursions, and she'd see how the privileged people managed to dress. Now she, at the age of 18, she had to leave the convent, set herself up sewing, and this of course really wasn't enough for someone as ambitious and determined to overcome the sort of humiliation of being sent into this poorhouse in many ways. And again, it's interesting in one family how you get one person who, you know, becomes world famous and the other kill themselves. I mean, it's you know, really, really interesting study that no one actually has done, and I'm certainly not doing, but I mean, everyone is so gaga about the clothes and about how she personifies France. Yeah. Anyway, she manages to, she starts singing in a cabaret where she gets the name Coco from, well, who knows? She writes her own biography. You know, Coco, the song that she sings has got Coco Corico, or it could be Coco being a kept woman. And in many ways, that's the one that she promotes, because everything about her, she always likes this little whiff of scandal. And in fact, that's the way in which now she is portrayed. You know, everyone, the House of Chanel has to admit that she was a collaborator at best. And so, but it's turned into kind of little whiff of sensual, you know, scandal. You know what I mean? It's seen as a positive, really, rather than a negative. Anyway, so she, Coco, then takes up a lover who is Etienne Vincent, who owns huge, that near Compiègne, stables, and there she becomes his mistress, and she, amongst other mistresses, as happened at the time, and she will meet, this is her here, not looking quite as glamorous as first slipped about things, but a lot of her, well, in fact, this is where she gets the padded thing for the bag. It comes from the jockey's outfits. She there meets the love of her life, boy Capel, who actually is an English aristocrat, and it's going to be through him that she will then go on and meet at Westminsters and so on. Now, when she had been at the convent, she I think once a year was taken out on a visit to an aunt who was a humble little hat maker. So this was also something that she thought she could do. So with her wealthy lovers, and this is really what she was just a kind of a kept woman, and who had obviously men were fascinated by her. That's something that comes again and again and again, and probably because she's so fiercely independent and so narcissistic and self-centered that they never felt they had her, you know what I mean? And I'm sure this is what was this sort of eternal sort of quest to possess this woman. Everyone seemed, all these men, regardless of where they came from, were fascinated by her. Anyway, so Capel actually sets her up in the Rue Cambon, where she still got the Chanel shop, and she sets herself up making hats, which will then gradually be diversified. At this time, she, through Capel, who dies, she manages to meet the Duke of Westminster, who was the wealthiest man in England, and they had an affair which lasted something like 6 years. She tried to have children with him, but I think she probably had so many abortions that she couldn't have any. So there she actually meets, through him, she will meet all of the royal family. He was a cousin of the royal family, and she will perfect her English. He buys for her the property on the Riviera, and it's there that she will then start designing these clothes for which she's famous, using the jersey material and the style of the sailors, you know, with the striped jumper and so on. Now, I just want to say a few things about this. Now, I don't know, I didn't go to the Chanel exhibition, not because I was not wanting to, the day I wanted to go, something else happened. But I know that in the blurb, they sort of say, you know, she freed women of corsets. I mean, that's just a lot of hooey. And at the same time, you actually have another dress designer, Lucien Lelon, who was designing dresses at the same time that looked like this. All right. He will eventually, get Dior, Givenchy and Balmain will actually work with him. His brand actually is not even known today because he didn't sort of have the right kind of affiliations during the Second World War, as did Chanel. So this is what I would consider a stunning sort of outfit, but as you can see, it's using the same lines, it's the same sort of material, and it certainly isn't working with corsets. So that's in 1838 when Chanel is designing. The other designer who was working at the time was Paul Poiret, who was immensely influential, but also ended up fighting in the war, and ended up actually in his maison de couture actually collapsed during the war, and so no one has heard much of him. But these are his designs in 1914. Now, this is before you're getting Chanel, when she theoretically liberates people from the corset. Judy, do you want to sort of move out to, can you see, if you want to move to the side, can you see better like that? Is that better? I'm sorry, it's something, the line of sight is difficult. Can everyone see? Yes, right. Thank you very much. So this is Paul Poiret in 1914. Now, as you can see, this is quite advanced. I'm looking now at the outfit with it's a skirt. There's not a sign of a corset. You've got this slouched long top. You've got the male kind of shirt with the white sleeves underneath. And this, of course, is sort of based in many ways on the kind of Cossack outfit. But again, you can see it's the idea of the line, the fall of the fabric, and there certainly isn't a corset. So I just wanted to say that, again, this is part of the myth, you know, that is being built up constantly. You know, she did everything except invent sliced bread. Poiret is the first person, not Chanel, as the blurb always says, the first person to introduce perfume. Poiret in 1911 was the first couturier to have his own perfume. He had this amazing sort of soiree where he got everyone to dress up in oriental outfit, and he had blossoms, you know, being thrown into the wind, and he was putting forward his perfume, which was a jasmine-based perfume, but it was named after his daughter, Rosine. This was quite successful, but never, of course, anything like what they call the monster. Evidently, every 2 seconds there is a bottle of Chanel No. 5 which is sold in the world, which is very interesting. Now, let's have a little look at the perfume. After having ended the relationship with Balsan, Capel, and then the Duke of Westminster, she manages to meet, you see, once you get into these stratospheric circles, she meets all the other crowned heads of Europe, and she begins an affair with Pavlovich Romanov. He's the one who actually has Rasputin killed. There was a famous perfume which was used at the court of the Romanovs, which was based heavily on jasmine. And it was pioneered by one of the great noses, who was Ernest Beau, who worked in France. And so it's through her lover, Romanov lover, that she's introduced to Beau, and she decides that she, like Poiret, is going to have a fragrance that will go with her outfits, and she will only sell it from her shop. And this is actually going to be quite an interesting story. So Chanel No. 5 is developed, and it's developed with the basis of jasmines and orris root, and so all of those sorts of things. But what he adds is the what's it called, amaldehydes, which are synthetic chemicals, which give a kind of a zing to the natural qualities that you have. And so he produces about 10 of these, and she chooses the 5th one and says, okay, it's going to be No. 5. Now, she was supposed to have said, well, she was against the idea of these very heavy perfumes that were made up of a single flower. You know, people used to go around smelling of either rose or jasmine or jonquil or daphne, and these were associated very much with not prostitutes, but the courtesans. And so she wanted something which was different, that had a fresh, clean smell. And she says, I want a perfume that makes a woman smell like a woman. Now, the thing is, this is another thing I need to tell you, that all of these so-called Chanel-isms, you know, the one-liners, it is now thought that they weren't written by her at all. She actually, at the end of her life, towards in her 50s, wasn't the end, had a long-standing relationship with Paul Riverdy, who probably, he wrote a whole book of Chanel-isms, because if you compare these one-liners with this clumsy writing, you know, she obviously had learned to read and write, but she certainly wasn't able to condense things like this. So even that's all false, but who cares? It all goes with, you know, these witty one-liners, you know, it's a bit like Ronald Reagan and all this. Anyway, so you also get the bottle, which doesn't really change, and the bottle again was quite revolutionary. I mean, she really did have a lot of ideas. She took them from others, but she did leave her stamp on them. And this was, the bottles at the time were convoluted Art Nouveau type, you know, rounded and spiral. And this square one was supposed to be based on the either the whiskey decanters of her English lover or the kind of things that he had in his travel pack. And the only thing that will ever change is the slight shoulders of the bottle will become thicker, because when it exported, it was too fragile. Now, it's only at this time sold through her shop. She decides that she wants to expand the market. And at the races, she meets Paul Wertheimer, who is the founder of the Bourgeois company of cosmetics. And I think I've told you that if you go to Paris, if you go to Monoprix and you get the Bourgeois, the Chanel and the Bourgeois come out of the same factory. All right, one has the label and the other doesn't, but it's more or less the same thing. Okay, so it depends on why you're buying something. Are you buying the label or are you buying the stuff? All right, but anyway, she meets him and he's Jewish, and this is going to be a huge problem. However, he has the ability to market this worldwide, as does his other friend, Théophile Bader, who was the founder of Galeries Lafayette. So the three of them go into business, a kind of unholy group, where Wertheimer will get, I think it's 70% of the profits. Bader will have 20, and she will get 10% of this, because she's just going to sell the perfume recipe to them. She doesn't really want to do any of the rest of it. All right, and she doesn't really think it's really worth very much money. And we really will need to talk about what happens with this after or during the French occupation, with the fact that she is working now in a company that owns her label, which is Jewish. Well, let's have a look at what happens in occupied Paris. 1940, the Germans sweep into France, you know, going, the Maginot Line was there, and the Germans just went round it. And to the great shock of the French population, and moved straight down into Paris with very little resistance. In fact, the French, many of them were quite welcoming. Hitler had done a very good job Hitler and the person who was actually occupying Paris, in saying there was to be no looting, there was to be no rape, there was no arresting, that the Germans were to behave incredibly well, and he had no intention of raising Paris. Paris was to be kept as a kind of fun capital of what would be the German Empire. All right, to be part of Germany, but he wanted his German soldiers and the Germans to be able to enjoy it. All right, so this was the idea behind the way in which the Germans initially were welcomed and the way in which they behaved. In 1940, June, Hitler, who was always revered Paris and as a sort of frustrated artist and art lover, visits Paris in one day, gets there at dawn with Spies, goes along, has photo opportunities in front of the Eiffel Tower, goes on a guided tour of the opera, and sort of says actually to the fellow, do you think we should tip the guide? And you know, these are really quite funny, you know, witness statements of what it was like to take Hitler on a guided tour of the opera. And in the end, the guide sort of, they tried to offer her, and she said, no, I don't want any of your money. So we now have Paris. Now, these are the kind of propaganda paintings that you go, or photos that are going to be sent out, always with one of the landmarks of Paris. I mean, this was, you know, the Eiffel Tower and the Arc de Triomphe. The Arc de Triomphe, what does it represent? Napoleon, the French Empire. What's it got? It's got German troops in it. So it's really, these images were very powerful, and they were sent out across the Allied world as well. Paris is completely taken over with goose-stepping, but extremely disciplined Germans to begin with, right? And of course, France is divided into Vichy, you know, with Marshal Pétain, sets up what is called the Free French Zone with its own government, but which really is basically just the servant of the Nazis. And as things get further and further into the war, the French milice, who were the French police or the sort of equivalent, not of the SS, but they would be the people who would carry out most of the dirty work in Paris. So in other words, it was French on French as much as it was German on French. And this is why the French need these icons to forget all of that era, and who only just had a couple of women who or resistance put into the pantheon now. You know, I think it was François Hollande who put them in. So this is what Paris looks like. You know, you've got all of this is Commandant von Gross Paris. You know, all of the signs up in German. And one thing that's actually quite interesting, at the end of the war, you actually had, if you went to Paris before the, you know, the Common Market, you would have sites where people had been shot, you know, against the wall, and had put, you know, this person was a martyr to the dark, ghastly Germans, blah, blah. And of course, once they went into the Common Market with the Germans, they had to take them all down and sort of put, now this is a, you know, they're now called the Nazis. So they still wanted the idea of the victims. It made it look as though the French had been fighting the war all the time, you know, and so on. So here we have occupied Paris. There they are having an absolute ball, sitting in the sidewalk cafes, and there's not too many people taking any notice of these German officers, as you can see. They also had a ball in the cabarets and the brothels. Here we have women sort of dancing away with virtually nothing on, and as you can see, the majority of people in the audience here are the soldiers, you know, who are, you know, quite, you know, correctly dressed and aren't brawling. So I'm not sure quite how much they were worried about the choreography, but anyway. One thing, and I thought this document is really hilarious. If you look at it, it's a document which was issued to all of the German soldiers, and it's all about the brothels, bordelle, and it gives you the list of them. On the one side, there's the, well, number 4, Rue Blondel. It tells you which metro stop to get off. You get off at Saint-Denis, and then it tells you which medical clinic is the nearest. I think it's typical sort of German practicality about memorizing, you know. I thought it was really quite hilarious. So that's, you know, they were making sure that you enjoyed Paris, but you didn't actually, you know, catch anything. Now this is on the Champs-Élysées. This is the Soldats Kino. This is the German cinema, where you would see German films as well. In other words, you can see the whole thing is completely Germanized. And here you have a Soldaten Cafe, with this is also under the command of larger Paris. Here are people talking to the German officers. And it's really interesting, particularly around Pigalle and around that area, you sort of wonder how many cafes that you go into now weren't actually German run, not German run, but worked with the Germans. And there was a huge amount of collaboration between the local population and the soldiers, particularly with the young women. Here you can sort of, it's just a random snap up in Pigalle. I think it was something like 40,000 children were born with German and French parentage during the occupation. So there was a huge amount of cohabitation. By 1941, the wonderful behaviour of the Germans things were getting more difficult. Germany was struggling a little bit more. The French men were taken off to work in work camps or in the mines in Germany, leaving women who were still rather nicely dressed, as you can see, who are now queuing for food. And of course, you're now going to get the beginning of the black market. By 1942, things are really dire. Here you have people going through the rubbish, all of them going through the rubbish, looking for anything to eat at all. So the situation was extremely delicate. There was some resistance, and so now you actually have the notice to the population of Paris that a German official or German soldier has been killed, and so hostages will be taken and will be executed. A number will be executed in relation to how serious they thought, or the rank of the person who has been killed. So there is this no longer this honeymoon time. It is a horrible time. And we are now also going to get the beginning of the campaign against the Jews. The Jews aren't allowed in here, both in German and in French. And the anti-Semitic cinema also develops. Here you have this idea of the Jew, le Juif et la France, the Jew and France. Here you've got this, I don't know whether it's the Rothschild, you know, who control the world. So there's always been this underlying anti-Semitism in France, but it comes very much to the fore. You know, it's just very much the legacy of the Dreyfus affair at the end of the 19th century. It's still festering away, and it comes out during the Second World War. And the milice who are working there now with the Germans, and in fact, they've managed to show that many of the RAF, or the roundups of the French, of the Jews in the Marais and in the 9th arrondissement, kids who were pulled out of schools, taken off to Drancy. This was done by the French milice, organised perhaps with the Germans, but the Germans really didn't have to do very much at all. The worst atrocity was the Val d'Hiver in 1942, when the Jews were all rounded up, those that were still there and hadn't been sent to Drancy, into the velodrome, winter velodrome, and they were kept there for 3 or 4 days without any water, without any food, and finally all shipped out to Drancy, and from Drancy you then went to Auschwitz. And when people asked Colonel Pétain, well, what about the children? You know, surely we should leave them. He said, oh, no, you wouldn't want the trauma of the children being separated from their parents. Send them off to Drancy and Auschwitz too. So, what is interesting now is, of course, please do watch the French elections, because you've got an extreme right wing, not Marine Le Pen, who's right wing, but Éric Zemmour, who is Jewish himself, but is, you know, very much sort of anti-immigration, and tries to excuse Pétain for the way in which he treated the Jews, which is extraordinary acrobatic act, but he still seems to get something like 14% of the vote. So do watch that. It's really very important in the way in which the French see themselves. Now, Rose Valland, what about her? Well, she came from a very poor background, but was a very intelligent woman. Her father was a blacksmith in the French countryside. She won scholarships. She became a teacher. She then entered the École des Beaux-Arts and managed to get a diploma from there, then actually went to the École du Louvre. But this is at a time when women don't actually have jobs. And so she, even though she's the most competent and knowledgeable of all people, she is actually sent at the time that we're talking about, 1940, to the Louvre. And the person who is in charge of the Louvre is Joubert, who will be a sympathizer with the Allies, he plays quite a large part in the saving of the French patrimony. So when they realize that Germany will possibly invade, Rose Valland helps pack up all of the great works of art and they're sent out to other castles, and Mona Lisa and all of the others. The works that basically will be taken by Goering and many sent to the Führer will be from Jewish families and from the smaller galleries that haven't been able to evacuate their works of art. So she then takes on, she's asked by Joubert to take on the job as voluntary curator at the Jeu de Paume. And the Jeu de Paume, as you know, near the Tuileries Garden, was going to be the depot where the works of art, which would be stolen and looted by the SS and by the Operation Rosenberg, which was set up by Hitler to take out the best works of art from France, and also set up by Goering. All right, so Goering has his own vast collection which he wants to augment. So she works there as an assistant. Now, no one, the Germans did not want any French people working there, but they eliminated them all. Forgot about this dowdy little woman, and you know, this is one of the best times to be dowdy, in the back room with sort of round glasses and sort of, you know, wouldn't say boo to a goose. No one really noticed her. It's interesting, isn't it? And so she was kept on. And not only that, she spoke German. Now, she'd been on a number of holidays. German was, of course, one of the great research languages of the time. And she understood perfectly what was going on. And she had a telephone in her little office and she'd listen. So for 4 years, she would be right at the forefront, working under the eyes of the Rosenberg people. I think it's 20 times Goering comes there as well. All right, so she's totally in the frame of where she could be denounced. And she found out actually after the liberation of Paris that they always had intended to take her off to Germany and execute her. So a number of times she was questioned, you know, by someone we'll see in a moment, that sort of thought there was something strange. And she said, no, look, I'm paying attention to these works simply because I'm an art historian. So the chance of actually having an art historian who was dowdy and spoke German, extraordinary coincidence. So here we have Hitler and Goering, both of them great lovers of art. Looking at some of the great works which would go into the Führer Museum at Linz. Now, enters into this story, and this is one of the most interesting stories that I've found when I was doing this research, was a man called Bruno Lohse. Now, he was an SS officer, 6 foot tall, who claimed he entered the SS because he liked the sport. You know, it's a bit like people who say they buy the Playboy for the articles, you know. So he was supposed to actually have got into it for the sport, and came to the attention of Goering because there was a call by Goering. He wanted art experts because they were going into France and they wanted to be able to get the best works of art. Now, this SS officer actually had a PhD in art and he spoke French. So he becomes the operator of the collecting of the stolen goods. So he would go with, every time that there would be a large Jewish collection, he would personally go with them because he thought that the people he would send out were too stupid to know what was good and what wasn't. So he personally made sure that they got the best works of art. But it wasn't just that, they actually took everything in Jewish households. All of the, you know, even the sheets and the blankets, and then they had these Jewish people at Drancy who then had to go through it and actually saw their own goods. And if they complained, they were sort of executed. So he's someone who was really responsible for the pillage of the Jewish heritage, and they burnt all the books in the synagogues. I mean, it was really awful. Anyway, the interesting thing about him, we'll come about him later. So here he is, this is him, second from, there's a little woman in a suit, then you get this tall man, that is Lohse, with Goering. Now, Goering sort of, thinks he knows a lot about art, but doesn't. And so Rose Valland has to sort of, not let the contempt that she has for this man show on her face when she's in the same room. Now, this is Rose here with Goering. And here we have one of the setups of art, which will be an exhibition which has been, it's not for the general public, it was just for Goering. Now, Rose Valland would take copious notes when no one was watching. She would, or else she had an extraordinary memory, and she'd go home and she'd write things down. She managed to work out where things were going because she talked to the drivers. She would copy the carbon copies because everything would have to go through in a, when you type, she'd actually go through and either sort of photograph them. She really was very, very dangerous work. She'd listen to telephone conversations and so on. So she, in the end, had this stockpile of extraordinary information, which she doesn't really want to give out very easily. This is the sort of thing that she managed to do. All right, she'd go home and write all of this out. This was the stockpiles of stuff. I mean, something like, I don't know, trains with 40 or 50 carriages, completely full of works of art and of silverware and things belonging to the Jews would constantly be taken out of Paris. Here you can see this being put on. Now, this was train 4044. Now, at the time of the liberation of Paris, just before it looked as though Paris was going to be liberated by General de Gaulle. In fact, they could have liberated it a lot earlier, but he wanted to be the person to do it. Churchill hated him, and you can sort of see why. There was this last train, which was this particular train, which had all of the most important works of art that were being hurriedly taken out to secret hiding places in Germany. And she had managed to record exactly where each of these wagons was going to. And she manages through Joubert to give it to the resistance so that the resistance would tell the Allies not to bomb the train, and then eventually they would derail. In fact, it took them a while. The French train drivers went on strike. What's new? And then also they derailed a couple of trains, and the train was blocked. Now, what I find sort of fascinating about this, it's the most extraordinary story with this woman. The Americans then make a film out of this called The Train, and it's all about the men who derailed the train. I mean, I think she gets a 5-minute cameo or something, even though she's actually there on the set telling them what to do, how to do it, how it all happened. So this continues even after the war. Now, meanwhile, back at the Ritz, you actually have, this is what it looks like, and Chanel is living in the suite. Now, the Ritz was owned by the Swiss, and so therefore it was, open slather. It was given over to the German High Command. It wasn't just anyone from the German army who lived there. It was the absolute sort of creme de la creme. So the fact that Chanel actually has a suite of rooms virtually next door to Goering means a lot about her relationship with the Germans. All right, so this can no longer be suppressed, so they try and make it look as good as it can be. This is what life was like. It went on exactly normally. There's a very, very good book called The Hotel on the Place Vendôme, which is written with all of the conflicting things that were going on in the Ritz. And in fact, there was a group of German officers who were working against Hitler. There were sort of collaborators, there were spies. It was a very interesting hodgepodge. But basically, when the occupation comes, Chanel closes her fashion house, and all of her workers, 5,000 workers, find themselves with no jobs at all. And she did this because just before the war, they had gone on strike because she used to pay them less than any other couturier. She was mean as hell, all right? And so this was a kind of revenge. She just dismissed them, so they had nothing to do. So she lived in the most extraordinary luxury here. The Germans were not allowed to wear uniform as they hobnobbed with the sort of, the rich Americans and the collaborators. Here she has her own suite. Here she is living it up at the Ritz. And she also now, this is the last relationship she'll have. There'll be several that I've missed out, the poets and the, all of these people. She had a big range of them, some people who were left-wing, some who were extraordinary right-wing, and so on. Von Dinklage, now he actually belonged to the intelligence unit of the German army. So, there's no doubt about that. She lived with him at the Ritz and will live with him for a number of years afterwards. Now, he manages to put her in touch with, there are two things. This is actually talking about her. This is a source in Madrid. Now, all of this paperwork only came out, I think, in the 70s, as we'll see in a moment. And she says Dinklage was attached to the embassy of Germany. He worked as a propagandist and is suspected to be an agent. And the same source at Madrid said that Madame Chanel, for the same reasons, persuaded the Baron to leave Italy and so on. So she was actually given two. She had a code name, which was Westminster, and she had a number, a serial number. And she went on an expedition to Madrid, and the person who was supposed to give the letter that she was carrying and all the rest of it actually turned around and denounced her. And then the person who denounced her ended up in prison. I mean, very interesting. And she also was involved in another expedition actually to Berlin called Operation Model Hat, where she was supposed to be, actually liaise with the second in command under Himmler. So as you can see, she was not just sort of anyone paving the way, and she was supposed there to be able to use her connections with Winston Churchill, as you'll see. There she is, having a great time at the Louvre. There we go. Of course, she's great friends with the Windsors, who Hitler was going to use once he had got rid of the King of England and conquered England. He would put them on the throne, and the idea is that there wouldn't have been particularly much resistance from the other members of the royal family or from the aristocracy. In fact, they've even got photos of Queen Elizabeth doing the Nazi salute. Have you seen those? Well, yeah. No, well, that's kept under. Yeah. All right, so this is the interesting part too. So she is then, at the Liberation, she is brought to, well, before I tell you that, she's going to end up with Dinklage in exile at the end. Now, after the occupation in 1944, we actually get de Gaulle finally coming in. So now you've got the different form instead of the goose stepping down the Arc de Triomphe. Again, the symbolic building, this is the whole city is a kind of, stage where you actually, all of this is played out. Incredibly tall, again, marked figure. Now, what happens after this? Well, the women who had collaborated with the Germans, now this meant that they just literally slept with one of the Germans. You even had, you can see they had their heads shaved as they walked down the street. They had swastikas drawn all over them, humiliated, often stripped naked and walking down the street. Now, did any of this happen to our friend? No, of course not. First of all, canny as ever. She's realised that things were going to get tough, and she, with the Americans as well. So she opens up her shop and gives out free Chanel No. 5 to any GI. So they weren't going to close her down, were they? I mean, this was the idea of bringing something back from Paris, which was quintessentially French, to their sweethearts. But she was brought before the tribunal and accused of collaborating, and a message went out within an hour or two. She was freed, and it was, and then she went into exile. And it is known that Churchill actually intervened, and the reason behind it is not that she was a double agent; it was the fact that she really knew too much, which was very inconvenient, in particular for the royal family, but she knew. So here we have her. They're great friends with Winston Churchill. He stayed with her after the war in her house on the Riviera. That's where he does his painting. Now, as usual, I'm going to go over a little bit, but I just wanted, I think this is fascinating. At the end of the war, now we're talking about Rose Valland, she was almost shot by the resistance in Paris because they thought she was a spy, but you know, she'd been working with the Germans at the Jeu de Paume, so she had a machine gun in her back. She's almost assassinated by them. After the war, very soon after, you get a group put together in America called the Monuments Men, right? And there's a film called The Monuments Men. If you want to go and see it, it's on YouTube. And it has a number of art, you know, he was ended up director of the Met, right? Art experts who will work on this. And in particular, Theodore Rousseau. Now, it took Rose, she was very suspicious of who she was going to give all of this information that she'd collected. She knew where these artworks had been hidden because she'd been able to listen in. So she knew where Goering had hidden them in the salt mines. She knew his own place. She knew the castle. She didn't want, you know, after 4 years of living like this, she wasn't just going to then just give it to the first person. So it took Rousseau a long time, he's one of the Monuments Men, to earn her confidence. And finally she sends him a bottle of champagne, and he knows that she is prepared to actually give over her information. And so it's at that moment that the Monuments Men start out to recuperate, I think it's like 60,000 pieces of art, of fine arts, decorative arts, and so on. Now, before I actually look at the way in which this is recuperated, I only be a few minutes. This is Rose over here, who was the fellow who was the art historian working for Goering, his right-hand man. Now, he was investigated by the Monuments Men because they knew that he'd been the person who had actually recuperated, taken these works of art. He says, oh, I just was following orders, and basically he is freed. And even though Rose Valland at the Nuremberg trials testifies against him, he is not taken into custody, or I think he might have had house, you know, detention or something like that, you know, a slap on the wrist. And he then goes back into Germany and continues to work on this clandestine art network. And the most amazing thing is that Theodore Rousseau, who basically was the person who interviewed him when he was caught, becomes a great friend of his. And they actually frequent each other. He goes to Germany, and then Loza, even though he's on the war criminals list, manages to come to New York City and liaises with people from the Met. So you begin to sort of wonder, you know, a lot of what happened to this missing art, which is still missing. Has it gone through into some of these great collections and been sanitized? The provenance has been sanitized. It's very hard to say, but there's obviously some form of collusion. And there's a book which has been written by a young American who actually interviewed Loza just before his death, and he died relatively recently. And he evidently had works of art in his vaults and on his walls, and had continued to be quite a successful dealer working in this network. So the whole thing makes you very, very cynical about everything. So these are the works of art that Rose Valland manages to recuperate. Now, she persuades the Americans. It's the Americans. Oh, Jinx has decided to come and listen to me. Jinx. She's used to me talking, right? Never perform with animals. It's the Americans who ask that she join the Monuments Men, and they appoint her to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, whereas the French only made her a captain, right? But she enters the military, and for I don't know how long, she will actually continue, and in fact, almost until her death, she will work to find these works of art. Now, when I said she was the most decorated person in history, she gets the Legion of Honor, the Medal of the Resistance, the Officer's Cross of Merit of Germany, because of the work she did there. And also she's made Commander of the Order of Arts and Letters by the French government. And there's also, she's given some, which I haven't got there, she's given some order also by the United States. So she continues working for the rest of her life. Now this is her, as you can see, she's no Chanel, but Chanel also, as my daughter says, what you are oozes from your face as you get older. Yes. And she looked exactly what she is, you know, which is this, you know, kept, you know, the tight mouth, she's not going to tell any secrets, someone who's an academic, and as opposed to Chanel, who of course is still there selling her wares. Now, Chanel comes out of retirement in 1954, at the time when de Gaulle says we're all resistors, and this is when she actually does her little suit that everyone raves about. Now, in 1970, no one is interested in collaboration. You don't want to hear about it. You know, I got a scholarship to study in France in 1969, and I remember at a dinner party I was welcomed by the Rotary thing and brought up something about the occupation, and people went red in the face with fury. I was never asked back. All right. So it was just something that it was, you know, no, we won the war, you know. Anyway, so here you have Chanel, this is 6 months before she dies, actually fitting Claude Pompidou, who is the wife of the then President of the Republic. And Claude Pompidou sort of saw herself as a bit of a fashionista. And when Chanel died, she wanted actually to have a state funeral, a heroine's funeral for this woman. And unfortunately, it was at that stage that fleetingly, some of this information about her work during the war surfaced, and they had to not at least cancel this extraordinary funeral. Now, Chanel had managed to suppress references to her poverty and her upbringing. She always makes out, you know, she lived in the country with stern aunts. She manages to make sure that she pays off the members of her family massively, so they won't say anything. All right, that's about her poor background. But also she manages to buy her way out of I haven't told you about the Chanel thing. All right, about the second in command, who she was supposed to have done the mission to Berlin for. He was writing his memoirs, but was also very ill, and she manages to buy him out by paying a fortune. She has her name suppressed from his memoirs. Now, I just want to very, very quickly just tell you the story about what happens with number 5. All right, remember, she only has 10% of this. Well, during the war, she realizes that this was something that was going to sell immensely. She could be immensely rich. And so during the time when all properties were being Aryanized, in other words, you couldn't own one if you were a Jew. And so because they were Jews, you see, Bader and Wertheimer, she then petitioned the government, the Vichy government, to be able to take back everything because they were Jews. However, Wertheimer had been very clever, and when he realized the Germans were coming in, he had fled and he'd sold his property to a puppet who was actually a Frenchman. So she was thwarted there. However, during the entire occupation, she carried out this warfare against the Jews, against these people who finally had her name. And then when she couldn't actually get that back, she then started selling other Chanel perfumes so that no one would know which was the real Chanel. So at the end of the war, Wertheimer comes back, reclaims the company from the fellow he'd sold it to. And then again, there's this huge legal struggle. And in the end, he comes to an agreement with her that she will get, I can't remember what proportion of the sales, and that they would pay for her lifestyle for the rest of her life. So again, you have these strange sort of interactions, people fraternizing. And in fact, the Wertheimers were very clever people because they realized that they were buying an empire. And they are billionaires today. And in fact, it is they who now own the Chanel brand. And they don't want it trashed by the fact that she was a scoundrel. And so even though she'd worked against them, it is the monolithic money stock exchange giant that is Chanel, which is actually winning out. And what has happened to Rose Valland? Oh, God. Here, in 2005, a plaque about this big has been put on the Jeu de Paume. And you get her name in the middle, Rose Valland, but it's sandwiched between blokes aggrandizing themselves. In the autumn of 1940, the building of the Jeu de Paume was taken over by the occupation for, stockpiling works of art. And under the order of Jacques Joie, under the order, so, it wasn't her, she just, she was doing it under the order, director of the museums, Rose Valland, who was attached to the conservation of the museums, followed and registered and so on, says what she does. And then underneath you've got who put the plaque on, which is Bruno Dieudonné de Barbre, of course, it's not Joe Bloggs, Minister of Culture and of Communication, in homage to this act of grace and resistance. I'm not quite sure who it's to, her or just. So even there, so in films and books, and if you look at Monuments Men, again, she's not even mentioned by her name. So the question arises, who have we heard of? Who do we venerate? What is history? I think that's really the question that I want to leave you with. Thank you very much.